Have you ever noticed that the best stories are the ones that have incredible plot twists? And especially when you think the evil guy is going to win, but then all of a sudden something happens and he gets what he deserves. Well, that's what happens in today's story in Esther. In Esther 5, 6, and 7, this is what we are told. So 3 days after fasting, Esther put on her royal robes and dressed up in her queenly clothes. And she went into the palace, into the court area where the king's throne was at. And she stood. And when the king saw her, he lifted up his scepter because he was happy to see her and said, "Esther, what is it that you want? I will give you up to half of my kingdom." And Esther said, "If it pleases you, King, I would like to invite you and Haman to my house for dinner." And so the king said, "Bring in Haman and we shall go to Esther's for dinner." And so that night, the king and Haman sat at Esther's dinner table and they drank wine together. And the king said, "Esther, what is it that you want to ask of me? I will give you up to half of my kingdom." And Esther said, "If it will please you, I would like to invite you back and Haman back to dinner tomorrow night. And then I will tell you what I want to ask." Well, Haman left the dinner very happy and full of himself. And as he was heading home, he passed by the gate where Mordecai was at. And he noticed that Mordecai didn't bow. And he wasn't even afraid of Haman. And this made Haman so angry. And he went home and he contacted friends and his wife and he invited them in and he was telling them, "I have so much. I have many sons and look at me. And I would have everything right if it just weren't for that man Mordecai. He just makes me so angry." And they said, "Why don't you just build a gallows 75 feet high and ask the king if you can hang him on it?" And Haman liked that idea. Well, that night, the king couldn't sleep. And he called the servant in and he said, "I want you to go get my book, the one that tells the stories about me as king, and bring it to me and read it so I can go to sleep." And so the servant did and opened it up, and he happened to go to the moment of when Mordecai learned of the plot from the two men at the gate that wanted to kill the king and how he had kept the king from being killed. And the king said to the servant, "Was anything done for Mordecai?" And the servant said, "No." And the king said, "Is there anyone in the hall? Can anybody help us? Let's see what we can do." And just then, Haman had walked into the king's hall, and the servant brought him in. And the king said to him, "What should I do to the man that I want to honor?" And Haman thought, "Who might he honor other than me?" And so Haman said to him, "I think you should get your nicest robe and a horse and have someone put the robe on him, sit him on the horse, and then ride him around the city shouting out, 'This is what the king does for the one that he wants to honor.'" And so the king said, "Great, do this for Mordecai." And Haman had to go and get the robe and get the horse and get Mordecai and put the robe on Mordecai as he sat on the horse and walk him throughout the entire city, shouting, "This is what the king does for the one he wants to honor." Well, he went home and he was complaining to his wife and his friends, and they said, "Oh, you can't do anything against Mordecai. If you try, it's going to cause you trouble. And just as they had finished saying that, the servant had come up to them and said, it's time for Haman to go to Esther's house for dinner. Well, when they sat down and as they were drinking wine and eating dinner, the king said, Esther, what is it that you want from me? And she said, if it would please you, will you save me? Will you save my people? Because someone is out to kill us. And the king said, who is it? And she said, it is that evil man, Haman. Well, the king was so angry, he jumped up and he went outside into the garden. And Haman knew that the king had already made his decision. So he went over to Queen Esther to beg her, and he fell at her lap and he was begging when the king walked in, and the king saw him touching her. And he said, what? You would even touch my queen? And he was standing there so angry, and the servant said, at Haman's house, there's a gallows that was built that he intended to hang Mordecai on. And the king said, hang Haman on it. And they took him out, and they did it. And once Haman was killed, the king's anger went away. May God honor the telling of his word. Do you see how quickly the plot changed? What did you learn about Haman? And what did you learn about the king? And what could you say you learned about Queen Esther? And even though God's name is not mentioned in this plot of the story, what can you say you learned about God? It's so important to be in the Word so that we can be with Jesus, so that we can be transformed. Shalom, y'all.